The first murder mystery story, as we think of those, I guess in its modern form we might say, commonly thought to be written by Edgar Allan Poe. His story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, 1841, is really kind of pinpointed often as the beginning of that genre. As a race, mankind, we like to find out who is responsible for something, especially when something bad happens. Maybe it's a noble motive in seeking justice. We want to find who is liable, who should be held accountable for something because they need to be punished, because justice needs to be served. Maybe it's more of a selfish motive and we want to look for a scapegoat so that we do not feel guilty ourselves. We want to shift that culpability away from ourselves. Or maybe it is just in the case of Edgar Allan Poe's story and those of any who would have come after him, Agatha Christie or Arthur Conan Doyle, you just want to figure out a mystery. You want to find out at the very end who done it. With a detective story, a murder mystery of that kind, at least as much interest comes from not only knowing who is responsible, but why they did it. No good story in the genre ends with, the butler did it, the end. And that's just how it ends. Well, how did he do it? It didn't seem like he did it earlier on. I thought it was going to be that guy. And, it seemed earlier like this person was going to be responsible. I thought the butler was over in the kitchen while all of this happened. How did he do it? Why did he do it? What drove him to that? Who were his accomplices? How did the detective figure him out? How is he so much smarter than we are that he could get to the bottom? Who matters, but why matters just as much. We'll consider both of these together this morning in contemplating really the greatest crime in history, the unlawful death, you might rightly call it a murder, of Jesus of Nazareth. First of all, who are some of the suspects? We're trying to assign guilt. Who is actually, literally, physically responsible? Where do you begin in assigning guilt for the death of Jesus? Now, that has been a subject of some controversy for, really since it happened, for 2,000 years almost, we might say. That has been a controversial subject. Who is responsible? Even more so, that became a controversy as the divide between Christian and Jew became more concrete in the later first century and afterward. One of my best friends in high school was a Jew, an Iranian Jew. And I remember that always being something he was very sensitive about, was the perception that Christians blamed Jews for the death of Jesus. And worldwide, I guess that is something that many Jews are unsettled by, the idea that, you tell us that we're accountable, that Christians blamed Jews as a whole for the death of Jesus, and that has, as I mentioned, been the source of some controversy. Well, we do have to figure out the answer to this question. Who is responsible? In a court of law or in an Agatha Christie novel, if you're pointing the finger at the end and saying, who actually did this? Who's going to have to pay? Who was responsible? Should we blame the priests, the scribes, the Pharisees? I've mentioned several groups there. We could just say the religious leaders, the people in power, those of the ruling class or the influential class, those who were the leaders of the Jewish people at the time. Turn over, if you would, to Mark chapter 3. We're not going to spend a great amount of time looking at the specifics in each of these cases. A lot of these people or groups are familiar to us, and we know how they factor into the story of Christ's death. But I do want to note just a few things as we progress. In Mark chapter 3, I look at verses 1 through 6 to remind us of the fact that antagonism towards, opposition towards Jesus actually began very, very early. We think of his ministry as unfolding over a couple of years, maybe 3 years, at least 2. And It is not the case that everything was going along fine and nobody had a trouble with anything. Jesus and his friends were just here in Galilee having a great time, and then one day they came down to Jerusalem and bam, the whole thing blew up and everybody started getting mad at him. In Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, we have an account of Jesus healing a man on the Sabbath, a man who was, well, he had some kind of infirmity. He had some kind of damage in his hand. It was withered, it says. I don't know exactly what that means. If it was an injury or a condition from birth, but he had something that was keeping him from working, and all manner of trouble that had caused him. Well, Jesus heals this man. The trouble is that it's on the Sabbath day, and the Pharisees in particular are not going to be fans of you doing something like that on the Sabbath day. They find Jesus saving this man's life, essentially, is how he phrases it, the imagery he uses. They see Jesus performing this. They know that it's a miracle. They know that it's something no one else could have done. It was not a normal event that transpired. And yet the key takeaway that they have from this is that this man is a Sabbath breaker. And so begins, in verse 6, they're plotting against him to destroy him. The Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the Herodians against him. These are not natural groups of friends. These are, in fact, political opposites and enemies in many ways. They plotted with the Herodians against him how they might destroy him. We find this in the other gospel accounts as well, that from this time they began to try to figure out how they could kill him, how they could undo him entirely. In chapter 7, just kind of following this same thread, in Mark chapter 7, we see Jesus again with the Pharisees, and some of the scribes now are mentioned. They are not the same thing as Pharisees, but they run in similar circles and probably would draw from among themselves for some of the makeup of both of those groups. But now we find the Pharisees, the scribes, coming to Jesus with another controversy, another thing that he's doing that they don't like. This time they don't think that he and his disciples are eating in the right way. They're not washing their hands properly, going through all of the ritual that is necessary before you partake of food. And Mark explains a little bit of those traditions for us. Jesus answers back with a pretty scathing rebuke and ends up revealing that these people are very far from God. So this antagonism, this very hostile relationship between the two parties continues to develop, continues to worsen. They are not making friends of one another. To the point that when we reach Mark chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, 2 days after the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by trickery and put him to death. Now you're reaching the terminal point in their plotting against him. And you've noticed throughout those passages, we've seen several groups discussed. You've seen scribes, Pharisees, chief priests, Herodians. As I mentioned a moment ago, these are not people who play bridge together. These are not people who hang out in the same circles. They are not friends. They, at most points in their history, have had exact opposite goals against one another. They have gone to quite literal war with one another in the not too recent history leading up to Jesus' life. Yet here they are all bound together in this conspiracy against Jesus because he is threatening their rule, their hold over the influence of the people, over the temple, and all of those other things. They are going to be the ones delivering him up to be killed. Could you blame the priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians? Could you blame them for the death of Jesus? Absolutely. They're culpable. They're the instigators of the entire thing and have been the instigators of the movement to kill him for years by the time he actually is put to death. Well, they do have some allies in this as well. You're going to see a Jewish multitude that has a very fickle relationship with Jesus. At times they want to hear everything that he's saying, and they want to see everything that he's doing, and especially they want to benefit from everything that he is doing. But they follow him around, and like some of the things he does, more often than not, though, you'll find great groups of the people who find some kind of fault. In Matthew chapter 11, beginning in verse 16, Jesus really points out something that is proven true time and again throughout history. We use the axiom sometimes, I guess, you can't please all the people all the time. And that's essentially what Jesus is getting to in Matthew 11, beginning in verse 16. It says it's like children, this generation, these people are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to their companions, saying, "We played the flute for you, and you didn't dance. We mourned to you, and you did not lament." He's talking about child's games that they liked to play at that time, apparently. The same way some of your kids might play church at home, or you might play Bible class, or you might play school or store or whatever it is. Well, these kids had a similar game. You might play wedding, or you might play funeral, as grim as that seems for us. But he's talking about kids who have their companions, and the companions aren't playing the right game at the right time. I wanted this, and you didn't want to do that. He says that's exactly how you're acting when you see people come to you from God. When you see a prophet come to you from God, like John, let's say, he doesn't eat or drink. He's this austere man out in the wilderness. He's got to have a demon. He's got something wrong with him. He's not what I wanted. And then the Son of Man comes to you, and he does eat and drink. Well, that's what you wanted, right? Someone who's a little more normal. Well, now they say, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. He can't possibly be a holy man because he eats and drinks. You're not going to be happy with anything. And this is borne out throughout his interaction with the Jewish multitude. John 6 is probably the best place that we could look to see this relationship and really why it was in the state that it was in. John 6 and verse 14, after Jesus feeds the 5,000, those men, those thousands of people, when they saw the sign that Jesus did, they said, "Truly this is the prophet who is to come into the world. We've found him. Everything we want is now delivered to us. This is our guy. This is what we should be doing. We need to take him right now." And in verse 15, go make him king. Start this movement right now. Get the ball rolling. We'll start gaining supporters. We'll be rid of Rome by week's end. This is with this kind of power harnessed. Think of what we can accomplish. Let's make him our king. Jesus perceives this and leaves. He departed to go again to the mountain by himself alone. And then even more pointedly, we see the view that Jesus has of this little movement they have in mind, beginning in verse 60. Actually, it begins earlier than that, when Jesus is delivering these, what they refer to in verse 60 as hard sayings, talking about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And they hear this kind of talk and think, what in the world is he talking about, and what have we gotten ourselves into? This is the man we're following around. Somebody talking about cannibalism, eating his flesh and drinking his blood. I don't know if I want to be a part of this. Who can understand that? And so verse 66 tells us, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. They decided that this was not for them. Just like those children playing in the market, they don't want to play the right game. He didn't do things the right way, and so we're not going to be around him anymore. Mark 15, I've mentioned as that last citation there. Mark 15 is just Mark's version of what we see occurring every time. When those scribes and Pharisees and priests, the chief priests, the elders of the people, all those people that we found accountable in that first point, when they deliver Jesus up and they're trying to get the trial going and they're trying to get the death sentence passed and they're trying to ultimately get this man on a cross, it will be multitudes standing nearby, yes, stirred up by the chief priests, but still speaking with their own mouths and their own throats to say, "Crucify him. Pilate says, "What do you want me to do with the King of the Jews?" They say, "Crucify him." Pilate says, "He hasn't done anything wrong. Are you sure about this? It seems crazy to me." And they say, "Crucify him." They're not going to be stopped. It's the multitude. Were the basic, everyday, average Joe people responsible? They definitely played their part. They shouted out for it. When other people were looking for an out, the multitudes did not give room for that out. Well, let's back up a little bit then. We've talked about Jesus being delivered up to his enemies. How did that happen? How did he get in that position? We saw in one of the accounts earlier when they were plotting against Jesus, they said, "We don't want to do this during the feast, not during the Passover. There's thousands of people here, and a lot of them do still like Jesus. That'll cause an uproar. There will be a riot in the streets if we do this during the feast. Start going and arresting rabbis. That just isn't going to work out unless we have a man on the inside." And so we find Judas entering the picture. Now Judas, John will tell us in chapter 12 and verse 6, was one of the 12. It seems that during his interactions with the 12, he had every appearance of being just like any of the other apostles, to the point that when Jesus is trying to identify his betrayer, they don't all immediately turn over and look at Judas and start saying, "He's talking about somebody being a rat, somebody being trouble among us, and it's obviously him. Look how sketchy he looks. Look how weird he acts all the time. It's clearly going to be Judas. He's the evil one." No, they don't do that. They're all saying, in fact, "Is it me? Could it be me?" They don't point the blame to him yet. But John will tell us, chapter 12 and verse 6, I assume this is something that came to light afterward, I don't know, but Judas was, for one thing, a thief. He was the keeper of the money box, where the disciples would keep their funds for their basic everyday needs. Well, Judas liked to take some out of the till, didn't he? We'll find that greed ultimately being his undoing in Matthew's account, chapter 26, when he goes to arrange his betrayal of the Lord. That's his question. "What will you give me?" "I'll give you Jesus. What will you give me?" All it took in the event was 30 pieces of silver, a pittance. And Judas delivers Jesus up to be arrested, to be tried under cover of night, and to ultimately be crucified. It's Judas who walks and gives Jesus the betrayer's kiss. It's Judas who knows of his own guilt in this, to the point that afterwards he can find no peace, no comfort, and ultimately his remorse, if we would call it that, is so great that he ends up taking his own life. Would we hold Judas responsible for the death of Jesus? He absolutely has some guilt attached to him. Without his action, who knows how things would have gone, if they would have gone as they did. Judas definitely plays his part. We do have to start looking at the leaders, the people who actually would kind of sign these death sentences. Luke tells us about Herod in Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 6. He's really the only one that includes this detail among the four Gospels. Jesus at one point is going to have his hearing before Herod. Now Herod, verse 8 tells us, Luke 23, verse 8, Herod was happy about this. Oh, I'm going to get to see Jesus of Nazareth, the man of the hour. I know what happened when he came in to the city on Sunday. The whole city turned out. People were shouting, people were raising all kinds of a racket because they think he's some great prophet. He can do things. I heard about the bread. I heard about the walking on water. I heard about him supposedly bringing people back from the dead, this Lazarus that they're kicking around over in Bethany. I've heard of all the different things that he can do. I want to see some of that. I would like to see a miracle in person. I mean, who wouldn't? If you could look at some water and watch it turn into wine, that'd be impressive. Herod, with almost childlike glee, is saying this will be wonderful. I finally get to come face to face with a miracle worker. He questions Jesus. He asks him who knows how many questions. And Jesus doesn't have anything to say to Herod. Jesus sees this pompous fool for exactly what he is and knows exactly the score of what is going to happen in this interview. He answers nothing, and so Herod begins to grow bored. He's not going to do a trick for me. I don't really have any use for this. Send him along to Pilate. Could we consider Herod responsible for the death of Jesus? I would say certainly by inaction, if nothing else. Yes. He can claim jurisdiction. In fact, that's exactly what Pilate is hoping for, because he doesn't want to deal with this mess. Maybe Herod will take him off my hands. And Herod does for a few minutes until he grows bored and wants a new trinket to play with, but he does nothing. A man in power who chooses to simply sit idly by while an injustice is carried out. We would certainly find that blameworthy. Well, we've mentioned his name a couple of times by now. What about Pilate? Let's look at the Roman authorities here. If Herod refuses to claim any power for himself in this ruling, maybe Pilate will do something noteworthy. John's account, I suppose, is the lengthiest treatment of Pilate's activity during the day. But really the impression that we get all along is that Pilate wants nothing to do with this. We mentioned it a moment ago. He tries to pass the buck to Herod because he sees rather quickly from the beginning this is probably not a capital case. This is probably not something that has anything to do with us, that has anything to do with civil government. This feels like a problem among Jews, something to do with their law. I don't know. I don't really understand or care to understand the specifics of it. But we don't need to be killing people over it. Let's send them back into the streets. All this will blow over in a little while. Surely they're just acting rashly, and we can speak reason to them. If I go out there in front of them enough times and say, "Are you sure you want to kill this innocent man?" Surely by the third or fourth time I go out there and say that, they're going to come to their senses, and we can do something different. But over and over again, Pilate appears before the people and asks them what to do, and he keeps getting the same answer. We want you to kill him. So Pilate finally, famously or infamously, washes his hands, as the custom was, to say, this might happen under my watch, but I don't have anything to do with it. I'm not assenting to it. I'm not really behind this. I'm not guilty of this. But is Pilate guilty of it? Again, he lets it happen. The soldiers don't move unless Pilate says go. The cross isn't erected unless Pilate says set it up. The sign isn't put over Jesus announcing who he is and what his crimes are unless Pilate has it written out and placed there. The nails aren't driven. The spear is not thrust into his side. None of those things happen unless Pilate and his men are acting with their authority. Well, any one of those 5 answers that we've generated, those would all make sense. They would each have to be considered as bearing some guilt, certainly. But as we mentioned as we began, the who is not necessarily as important, or no more important at least, than why. And I would like for us to consider in our remaining time, if we strip the names away and can identify the motive, the why, rather than simply the familiar faces attached to those, the kind of villainous faces that we attach to these, maybe we start seeing some of the underlying reasons, the attitudes that led to the death of Jesus. Not just Pilate because he was a weak, evil coward, and Herod because he was a foolish, evil despot, and Judas because he was a wicked betrayer, and the Jewish multitude, because they were so fickle and could be induced to that kind of violence, or the scribes and the Pharisees and the chief priests, because, well, of course they were evil. They're the bad guys of the gospel story. If we take all of those familiar names away and start looking at why did they do this? Should we blame the priests, the scribes, and the Pharisees? Well, let's first look at them as simply those who saw their traditions being upset and simply wanted to keep doing things the way they'd always done them. They wanted to hold on to their power and to their thing and not have that balance upset by anyone. That seems to be the chief reason the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the chief priests, the elders disagreed with Jesus. You'll read some doctrinal differences. You'll read some things they probably disagreed with about the law, certainly their practice of it. But more than anything else, their hatred to him is stirred because, as we saw in Mark's account, look, he breaks the Sabbath. Look, he doesn't wash his hands. Look, his disciples are breaking the Sabbath. Look, he's not doing what we do. If someone came along today and started a church that didn't follow our traditions, what would our view of that be? This wouldn't be a man who's breaking any commands of God, but maybe they don't have a Wednesday evening service. Maybe they don't have an invitation song. Maybe their preacher doesn't wear a tie. Maybe they don't do some of those things that we do. How would we feel? The point of this, as it will be with each of these, is to ask us what really matters to us in our pursuit of God. What is important to us as we are trying to find God and our right position before Him? Do we really have eyes for Christ? Or have we, for instance, made our own traditions into a code on par with God's Word and God's will? And might that at times interfere with us truly seeing the Lord for who He is and truly seeing our work for what it is meant to do? Are we disciples of Christ, or are we just members of the church? I hope you understand. One can mean the other. If you are a disciple of Christ, you're a member of His church and of His body, and you need to act as such. But if we are taking our strength in God and our nearness to God simply from the fact that we come to the right place with the right name on the building and do the right stuff, that's not a disciple of God. We must seek out Christ. The scribes, the Pharisees, the priests, all these men that we're talking about, their problem is they're not looking for Jesus Christ. I should say they're not looking for Messiah. They didn't care what His name was, Jesus or otherwise. They're not really looking for the Lord's anointed. And we find that in some men in the New Testament. That wasn't an issue that no one could come to. That wasn't something that you just could not find in Israel in that day. Someone who's looking for the Lord's anointed, because you read of plenty of people who were doing that, who were looking for the consolation of Israel, who were looking for the anointed one. They were looking for the prophet. They were looking for this man who would come. And many of them identified Him when He came. They could get past their own baggage. They could get past their own will and find in the Lord what they should have seen. We can do the same. Well, what about that up and down, fair weather Jewish multitude? We can call them that. I think we can also call them people who wanted a different kind of Messiah. One who's a little less spiritual, a little more worldly. A little less into all of this talk about future kingdoms and kingdoms that are not of this world and all this sort of thing. And one who's a little bit more invested in the Roman garrison up on the hill. Getting us our kingdom back. Getting us our power back. Let us ask ourselves, where is the real focus placed today? Think carefully about this. This is not a rhetorical question, a hypothetical question, a question for the other guy sitting next to you on the pew. Really ask yourself and consider, Are you more concerned with your soul or your life here on earth, right here and now, and your success, your material wealth, etc.? If asked to choose in some kind of what would you like God to do for you survey, if that's the question being asked, and you're not answering publicly, judge you for your answer, just what your heart really wants, and you're choosing between eternal life, for instance, and having all of your wildest dreams come true right now on this earth. You'll be famous. You'll be wealthy. You'll be happy. You're going to have a great job, or maybe no job. You just go do what you want all the time. People are going to love you. You're going to have great health. You're going to be good looking. Everyone around you is going to be good looking. All the kinds of things that you like to enjoy, that you want to have happen to you, are going to happen right now. And it's going to be your lot for the rest of the time you're here on this earth. And it's going to be a long time because you get that long, happy, healthy life along with it. Which of those would you choose? Which of those might the average person choose? Which of those might the average Christian choose? If we were really telling the honest answer that is in our hearts. Because when you start talking about this eternal life stuff, and you start talking about heaven, and you start talking about eternity with God, that's so far in the future, man, I can't think about that now. And who knows if it's even real? That's not something that I've ever seen. I've never talked to somebody who's experienced that. I don't know if that's really what I should be banking my happiness on. Maybe that sounds like a ridiculous premise. And I hope to you it sounds like I'm up here saying, what's that guy talking about? Of course you're going to choose God. Of course you're going to pick eternal life. But do we know for sure that we'd choose that longer-lasting, more important spiritual stuff? Don't dismiss it offhand. We make trades on our future, against our future, all the time. We betray our true desires through our behavior. And a lot of times it feels like we are looking for a Messiah. We are looking for a God who works for us, not in the hereafter, but for the right now. That's not where our treasure lies. That's not where our hope lies. It simply can't be. Well, we see Judas Iscariot, that betrayer. Again, a familiar face, a familiar name. You haven't met baby Judas probably in a good long, long while. That's not one that's being handed out very often. But strip away that familiar name. What's really happening? Why does Judas end up in the position that he's in? What leads him to that? It's simple. He's willing to betray his friend because he's selfish, because he wants what he wants. Now here again, we're on familiar ground. What are we really in it for? For God or for ourselves? For God's people or for ourselves? For the world who needs to know what I already have or ourselves? When really pressed to make a decision, the reality is that we often choose our own comfort and our own will far more often than we'd really care to admit. No matter what kind of show of piety and allegiance we might make publicly, we might carry around that same greed that undid Judas. Where if the right situation came along that I could profit on, abandoning my faith or abandoning my duties to God so that I can have this thing that I want, my own 30 pieces of silver, I'm going to take that deal. And it may be financial greed, it may not be. There's often something we simply want for ourselves more than we want to do something for God. It's more time, more freedom, more sex, more respect in the community, more of something that we want. I'll take that. And if that means that God's kingdom suffers for it, if that means that my relationship with God suffers for it, so be it. I can have remorse later, can't I? Well, what about Herod? Herod has his part, but if we fast forward that attitude to today, I think we'd find in him just someone who got tired of seeing somebody that wasn't going to do a trick for him. He got bored, he got disinterested as soon as he realized his curiosity wasn't going to be satisfied in Jesus. He wasn't going to get to watch stones turn into bread on that day. He wasn't going to get to watch somebody walk across a pool of water. And so I guess I'm done with this. Let me say that this might be a most pressing danger with newer Christians, though it can be trouble for all of us. But when we don't see some impressive show of dramatic divine power in a moment of need, or maybe just a moment of boredom or curiosity, do we stick around? If there's no magic trick after I follow him for a while, maybe I lose interest. And I start wondering what's really the difference between what I'm doing now and what I was doing then, because nothing cool has happened. If my circumstances don't change for the better, if I keep coming to these little meetings that these people are having here, and there aren't any interesting or esoteric secrets being revealed, I'm not getting some kind of arcane knowledge through showing up at these Bible classes, I might not stick around. There's just nothing that really grabs my interest enough to stay on. If we do that, I hope we understand we have the same shallowness and foolishness that you would find in a Herod, who doesn't understand that he's standing before the King of all things, the creator of all things that exist, the God and ruler of all, who was eternally and will be forever. He is standing in his presence, and the only thing he can think to do is, will you do a trick for me? That's foolishness. That's lunacy. If we approach God with this same idea of simply saying, what can you do for me to keep my interest in you? We've already lost. We've already forgotten who we are and what we are to be about. Well, let's consider finally in Pilate, the man giving the order, but ultimately a man who was a coward through and through, the worst kind. He's so afraid of the cost to himself that he decides, I'm just not going to do anything. I can punt on this one. I'll wash my hands. Sure, I'll give the order, I'll do what they want, but everyone knows this wasn't really me. Paralyzed by indecision, and that ends up being decisive. And maybe that's the case with us sometimes. It might just be that cowardice wins out in the end. I would give Christ my allegiance, but think of what will happen to me if I do. Think of what could happen. Think of the awful possibilities. I could lose so much. I could lose friends. I could lose my job. I could lose my comfort. I could lose income. I could lose all of these other things that I like doing and filling my time with. The risk is too great, so I'll just put off the decision for a little bit longer. Or I just stay content in saying that my hands are tied. If things were easier, if other people do like I want to do, let me do like I want to do, I'd be a Christian. But as things stand now, I can't. I won't. Even though it's not my fault, I'm not going to do that. Do we live with that same Pilate-like cowardice that's willing to say, I could do something, but I won't? Ultimately, as you might have guessed in a sermon like this, and as the songs Brother Wilburn led for us were indicating, we can't escape the conclusion that the finger of blame points squarely at ourselves. We can talk about these 5 groups and others who played their own roles. We could talk about those for hours at length and try to parse through exactly who did the most harm in that case. But again, this is all wrapped up in the why. Who is important, but why just as much so? The root cause of the death of Jesus is what? Sin. It was a sacrifice for sin. That's why he came. That's why he was here in the first place. That makes the equation very simple then, doesn't it? Have you sinned? Then you're responsible. Have you done something that is a trespass against God? Then Jesus died for you. You're the one. I'm the one. We did it. Now, this is complicated a little, we might say, by the way Scripture treats the death of Jesus. Not merely as a crime, but as a decisive act. Brother Welch read for us from Acts 4 before I came up this morning. In Acts chapter 4, when the disciples are praying, they mention and they describe all those things that Pilate and that Herod did, and all the things that the Jews and that the leaders of the people did in taking Jesus and crucifying him. How do they describe that? What God appointed, what God planned and purposed to happen. Jesus was not merely victim. We could say he was not victim whatsoever. He was Lord. His life wasn't taken from him in some nighttime tragedy. He laid it down willingly. It is depicted as the plan, the eternal purpose of God. So our question might appropriately shift from who was responsible for killing Jesus and why did they do it? Shift that instead to why did God want this to happen in the first place? What was the plan behind all of it? Why did the Father send him? And the answer to that question, brethren, is just as simple. Because you sinned. Because he knew that we needed that. God's love for you demanded that he prepare a way for you to be right with him once more at all costs, even if it means his Son coming to the world and being rejected and being betrayed and being arrested and being beaten and being crucified. That is what it took, and that's what he was willing to do because he loves you and because you have sinned against him, and he wants those two things to be rectified. If we have hearts that desire Christ, to the exclusion of all the other things that get in our way of finding him and following him, we can receive the benefits of that sacrifice. We can say, not from a hypothetical or prospective standpoint, why did Jesus die so that people can be saved? And we can instead say, why did Jesus die so that I am saved? Because I am right now since he did. And we hope that that is the lot of every person here this morning. That you can say that of yourself in absolute confidence. I know why Jesus died, and I know that that's how I'm saved. He did it for me. Not so that I will walk around day and night feeling guilty, but so that I will walk around day and night knowing that I belong to him. That I'm right with God because of what he did. We offer that invitation, that offer, to all who are here today. If you have a need that we can assist with, come to God. Respond to the Savior who wants to save all. It is what he does. It is what he is. He died for us. Would we make that in vain? Would we make that, on our account at least, personally speaking, a waste? What a terrible waste it would be. We think of waste in those terms often, the value of what was used. When you can't get that little last bit out of the tube of toothpaste, you're wasting a little bit, but not much. Especially me. I've got that down to a science. I can roll that thing up, squeeze it out, get a machine press that you're putting down, and I get all of the toothpaste you can get out of it without exploding it. But if you don't get all of that out, well, it's, 2 cents? What are you really wasting? You don't finish your meal at lunch today, but you didn't finish the green beans or whatever it is. Well, would have been good to eat that food, but nobody's dying if you don't. You look at something of terrific value that is wasted. Someone's fortune, someone's livelihood, someone's life. How much more would we say if the very Son of God, King of Kings, suffered literally excruciating torment, and died so that you can be saved, but you're going to squander it. I can't think of a bigger waste. There's not one. It would be simply tragic. And not from the standpoint of, I'm going to be disappointed in you. Your parents are going to be disappointed in you. Boy, I wish you'd quit wasting things. Eat those green beans. No, a tragedy from the standpoint of, you could have been eternally blessed with God, and you chose not to. You would never forgive yourself. If you have the need this morning to repent of sin, turn from it, and begin following this Christ who died for all, do that today. Be baptized into his death. Take your part alongside him. Take up your cross daily and follow him to whatever future that holds, knowing that the ultimate end is to be with him, saved, safe at last for eternity. If we can help, come forward right now while we stand and sing.